Welcome to today's video, where we'll be taking an in-depth look at one of the most significant and devastating conflicts of the 20th century, the Iran-Iraq War. The Iran-Iraq War, which lasted for 8 long years from 1980 to 1988, was not only one of the longest in modern history, but also one of the deadliest, with both sides suffering immense casualties. What began as a territorial dispute quickly escalated into a war that would reshape the Middle East and have lasting consequences for the geopolitical landscape of the region. In this video, we will explore the key events, the major battles, and the political maneuvering that shaped this complex and devastating war. We'll also discuss the long-lasting effects that the Iran-Iraq War had on both countries and the broader Middle East, a region still grappling with the consequences of the conflict today. So stay with us as we break down one of the most impactful wars in modern history, the Iran-Iraq War. In the winter of 1979 to 1980, relations between Iran and Iraq worsened after years of peace. People held violent protests in front of the Iraqi embassy in Tehran, calling for the fall of Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist government. The Iranian government sent its air force into Iraqi airspace to pretend to attack Iraqi bases, leading to bombings, closure of Iranian consulates, and reaffirmation of control over the Shatt al-Arab River. The Iraqi government, led by Saddam Hussein, sought to stop Iran's moves using force. When the Shah was ousted in February 1979, the harsh oppression continued, with fierce fights between revolutionaries and Shah's old allies. The Iraqi government, however, only said nice things about the opposition, believing they could not overthrow the revolutionary rule. In response, the Iraqis armed movements for independence in Kurdistan-Baluchistan and the oil-rich Khuzestan province. The fighting between Tehran and Baghdad escalated, with Ayatollah Khomeini warning the Iraqi people to make revolution until victory. The Iraqi government asked for the Algiers Accord to be revoked, and the two countries agreed to define their land and water borders. A bombing occurred in Baghdad University, killing 12 trainees and arresting a Shiite agitator suspected of working as a double agent for the new Iranian Secret Service, Savama. The Iraqi government blamed Tehran, and Ayatollah Beheshti accused Saddam of being a puppet in the hands of the United States. Saddam Hussein warned Khomeini and ordered the execution of Ayatollah Mohammad al-Sadr, who had been with the supreme leader of the Iranian Revolution while in exile. Khomeini publicly called for the removal of Hussein and criticized the monstrous and perverted regime of Iraq's Ba'ath Party. Gulf monarchies knew they would have to support Saddam's government to stop the Shiite movement in Iran. In April 1980, the Iraqi government faced a psychological war due to false information about Saddam Hussein's death. The Iraqi government gave asylum to the Barzani brothers, two leaders of the Kurdish rebellion in northern Iraq from 1974 to 1975. To prevent the Kurdish front war from starting again, the Iraqi government gave more power to Jalal Talabani, who led deadly attacks against Peshmergas. Talabani took control of cities in Iraqi Kurdistan and worked out a deal with Saddam Hussein to split up the Kurdish guerrillas and keep them from working together against him. In Iran, President Bani Sadr stepped up operations against the new government and kept a close eye on the military out of fear of a coup d'état. On July 4, 1980, General Ovaisi announced he could control Tehran by the end of the summer. However, the revolutionary government responded strongly, arresting over 600 soldiers and executing most of the accused. The Air Force was already in trouble due to firings, bad training for crews, and a lack of extra parts. The failure of the plot made Saddam Hussein's belief stronger, as he knew that a major move to overthrow the Islamic regime was about to happen. He knew that the Iranian resistance no longer had a chance, and the Kurds, Azeris, and Baloch were fighting for their own freedom and independence. Saddam knew it would be a mistake to expect the US or the USSR to send troops to help and depend on the oil kingdoms. In July, Saddam called a meeting of his chiefs of staff to ask them to get ready for war with Iran, but he only gave his generals 1 month to get ready. The Iraqi force was not really ready for battle, and its performance was worse than that of the Iranian army in most ways. Logistics were not planned out, and the drive stayed. The Iraqi forces would have been ready to fight either to defend their country, fight the Kurds, or go into Kuwait, which they thought of as part of Iraq. As the power battle in Tehran continued, Ayatollah Khomeini relentlessly followed his goals, strengthening the Islamic Revolution, setting the stage for the clergy's rise to power, and stopping Iran from slipping again under the control of a foreign power. Led by Ayatollah Beheshti, the secular camp took advantage of differences in ideas and openly attacked President Bani Sadr, making the areas of Khuzestan and Kurdistan less stable. After the revolution, Bani Sadr sent extra troops to both provinces, including the 92nd Armored Division, 2 tank battalions, and 3 infantry companies to guard the border with Afghanistan. He planned to kill Pakistan's freedom and help the Arab Front for the freedom of Alawaz. The Iranian government's toxic mood in Tehran worsened as it appeared that they couldn't fix the economy. In 1980, Iraq and Iran faced intense fighting along the border, with Iraqi power being bought with crime to make a case for war. The Iranian government wanted to avoid witnesses and allowed foreign reporters into war zones, strengthening the international community's lack of trust in Tehran. Artillery was called in on September 4th, and the Iraqi towns of Kanakin and Mandali were hit. Saddam Hussein accused the Iranians of starting a war and ordered his army to take back areas of Iranian land that Iraq claimed. Iraqi troops backed by Rocky Rocks and the Shatt al-Arab were taken over by artillery and tanks, resulting in the loss of about 100 soldiers. Air battles were also seen, with 5 Iraqi helicopters shot down and an Iranian Cat shot 1. Iraqi pilots were upset, and the Iranians returned at them, using the Tomcat air superiority fighters. The Iranians fired one of its long-range Phoenix rockets at President Bani Sadr. On September 16, Saddam Hussein announced his decision to attack Iran, with only his first cousin, Ali Hassan al-Majid, present. The Iranian president then called his generals together and told them to leave immediately to go on the attack, without waiting for a small delay. On September 17, 1980, Saddam Hussein declared the Algiers Accord invalid and demanded that the Shatt al-Arab River be returned to its historical state. He crossed the last line that separated him from going to war with Iran, asking the Iranian government to start talks to finalize the river's new state. The Iranian Minister of Foreign Affairs stated that his country did not agree with either of the Iraqi government's offers to talk or the abrupt ending of the Algiers Agreement. The situation worsened on the ground, with Iraqi weaponry aimed at the city of Abadan. 2 Iranians were in the air, but one pilot died while the other was able to escape. Sub-Lieutenant Hossein Lashkari was captured by Iraqis and held by Iraqis for the longest time. On September 18, 1980, the Iraqi government made their choice to attack that day, giving them only 3 days to tell their troops. The time bomb was set to go off, and Iraq had no way to stop it. In normal situations, the Iraqi government would not have been able to begin a fight with Iran due to its size, population, and military spending. Iran's oil pipelines connected to the plains along the coast of Khuzestan, where its main oil sources and hydrocarbon deposits were located. Iraq had too many weapons to make up for its basic flaws and built a huge army of 250,000 men. The Iraqi military was a blend of British and Soviet methods with a mix of armored and armored units. The Air Force had 295 fighter planes, 11 Air Force bases and surveillance radars. The Navy had 14 missile boats, 3 amphibious attack ships, and 28 light patrol boats. The government politically charged the Iraqi army, making it less likely to take the lead. The top corps, such as the Armored Brigade of the Republican Guard, Special Forces and engineering troops, were the best defense. Iran's army had 290,000 men, divided into 7 corps, 3 armored, 3 motorized, 1 infantry division, and 7 deterrent units. The Iranian army used its features in their army, making logistical tasks harder. However, after the revolution, the Iranian army faced problems with quality, including over-politicization, political commissars, competition, bad communication, and insufficient training. The top military system also had problems, with no general or colonel having operational knowledge or ability to lead. Despite the balance of forces being in Iraq's favor, the Iraqi military's decision to fight Iran may have contributed to the blitzkrieg. Make the background music historical, war mode. In September 1980, Iranian leadership recognized the danger of war and met with the principal commanders of the armed forces. The National Security Council, led by President Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, listened to the alarmist opinions of the military's leaders who were aware that the army was unprepared. Tension arose due to the president and prime minister's opposing camps. In Baghdad, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein named the offensive Echo of Qadisiyah in reference to the Battle of al-Qadisiyah, which had become a symbol of Arab victory over the Persians. The Iraqi operation began with an attack on its adversary's Air Force bases. General Mohammad Jessim al-Jabouri, commander of the Air Force, followed Hussein's wishes, focusing on neutralizing runways and logistics depots to prevent the Iraqi Air Force from taking off and winning air superiority over the front. However, military strategists prioritized striking the adversary's radar and anti-aircraft systems, despite not having any missiles specially conceived for such a mission. On September 20th and 21st, 1980, General Salim, Chief of Air Force Operations, discreetly inspected the 6 Air Force bases and passed on his orders and objectives. The attack would take place at midday to avoid detection by enemy radar. Pilots and mechanics worked tirelessly to prepare the planes, filling tanks and attaching runway denial missiles. On September 22, 1980, the Iraqi Air Force launched a series of 250 attacks on Iran. The first wave involved 192 planes, each with a specific order and timing. The assailants flew nap of the earth in formations of 4 to 6 planes, maintaining total radio silence. Iraqi fighter planes were on call to assist them in case they were intercepted while returning from the mission. The first planes to reach their target were Su-20s from Kirkuk, who bombed the Noja Air Base in Hamadan at 1:45 p.m., causing some damage to the runways. The Su-22s from Mosul struck the Tabriz Air Base, lightly damaging it but not being a prey for Saddam's Falcons. The other planes were safely tucked away in their concrete hangars. Following the attack, 5 Tu-22 bombers from Tammuz flew over Tehran at very low altitude and split into 2 formations. The first attacked Mehrabad International Airport, which was base to a Phantom squadron. The second formation bombed the Air Force Command's barracks, but the Iraqi pilots missed their target. The last 4 Tu-22s reached the Shiraz Air Base, the most distant of the day's targets. The Iraqi pilots landed a few bombs on the runways and blew up an arms depot, but failed to destroy any of the precious interceptors. The Iraqi Air Force put an end to the assault with this second wave, ordering most of its aircraft to be scattered among secondary airfields, and sending some of its heavy bombers to Jordan and North Yemen to protect them from an Iranian counterattack. At the end of the day, only 4 enemy planes were destroyed versus 5 planes lost. The Iraqi airbase commanders were left to their own devices for the first 24 hours of the conflict due to the surprise attack and lack of proper contact with their chiefs of staff. They devised an operations plan conceived under the Shah, calling for the simultaneous attack of Iraqi air bases. Colonel Javad Fakhuri, the commander of the Air Force, successfully coordinated the counterattack, aiming to strike the enemy as soon as possible, affect its morale, and show the Persian Lion would not let itself be assaulted without consequences. On September 23, Mehrabad, Hamadan, Bushehr, and Tabriz bases were ready to launch 120 Phantoms and 40 Tigers, all armed to the teeth. The first planes took off at 5 a.m. and immediately headed west to Iraq, in formations of 8 aircraft. A Phantom crashed at takeoff, killing the entire crew, but the operation did not disrupt the operation. The pilots descended to extremely low altitude and accelerated to maximum speed, flying at more than 560 miles per hour, 65 feet from the ground. They turned back without any losses, just as the anti-aircraft defense was coming alive. Iraqi surface-to-air defense fired a long succession of SAM-2 and SAM-3 missiles, many of which fell back on the city and its surroundings, killing numerous civilians. The Tammuz air base in Baghdad was targeted by Iranian Phantoms, who had been attempting to catch Iraqi bombers. However, the Iranian pilots faced challenges with the base's surface-to-air defense, leading to several attacks on the Iraqi capital and the international airport. The Persians also attacked the Kut and Nasiriyah airfields but were intercepted by MiG-21s. The Iraqi pilots managed to damage 2 Phantoms before they could escape. The Iraqi Air Force attempted to destroy the strategic bridge over the Tigris at Amara, but only 5 planes were ready to attack the bases again. The second wave focused on the Basra and Kirkuk airfields, which were heavily defended. The Iraqi Air Force attempted sporadic raids against the Tabriz and Bushehr air bases without significant results, losing 2 MiG-23s shot down by Iranian fighters. On September 24, 1980, Iranian leaders met with Air Force commanders to plan the continuation of operations. They prepared an operations plan called Kaman, or Crossbow, which would serve as their guide for the next few days. The plan was to try and devastate Iraqi forces in flight, since they were unable to destroy them on the ground. On the same day, the Iraqis attacked the bases again, relying on their anti-aircraft defense to repel their assailants. Despite the Iranian bombers' direct hits, they also targeted Iraqi oil infrastructure, bombing refineries, fuel depots, and damaging the oil pipeline connecting Iraq to Turkey. The Iraqis then launched raids against the Bandar Khomeini petrochemical complex and Awaz fuel depots. Colonel Fakhuri, an Iraqi Air Force commander, engaged in combat with the Iraqi Air Force, causing significant losses. He ordered Tomcat early warning patrols to stop covering major Iranian cities and engage the enemy near the border. The Iranian pilots used their sophisticated radar to position themselves at the best angle to fire their long-range missiles, resulting in the Iraqis losing 40 planes and the Iranians 24. Iraqi General al-Jabouri prudently ordered an end to the raids, limiting its missions to the protection of Iraqi territory and backing ground forces. Despite the losses, Fakhuri had humiliated the Iraqi regime and demonstrated his devotion and loyalty to the Iranian regime. President Bani Sadr urged the government to free pilots and mechanics in Iranian jails, who were eventually freed. The regime put the airmen's families' fate in their hands to guarantee their loyalty and avoid defections. Saddam Hussein's plans for the offensive were based on preparatory documents from a 1941 British maneuver plan. The Iraqi generals estimated they could easily reach the same objectives with 10 divisions, half of them armored, and rely on significant artillery support. The main thrust was to take control of the cities of Dezful, Awaz, and Khorramshahr, isolating the Abadan oil complex. Iraqi troops on the other side of the border did not represent an immediate threat to Iraq, as they were busy fighting their own Peshmergas. On September 20th and 21st, Adnan Kairala, the Minister of Defense and cousin to the president, conducted a border inspection to meet the commanders of the 10 divisions involved in the assault on Iraq. The Iraqi generals were advised to be cautious and advance slowly, following the manual and limiting risks. The attack was scheduled for dawn to coordinate with the air offensive and ensure the assailants did not have the sun in their eyes. The first wave of fighter bombers took over with 1,600 tanks, 2,000 armored vehicles and 4,000 trucks, heading towards the Zagros Mountains and Khuzestan. The force ratio was close to 4-1 in favor of the Iraqis. The Iraqi advance guard entered the encircled city, defended by a detachment of military police, a few regular police forces, and a Revolutionary Guards company. The Pasdaran successfully destroyed the Iraqis' lead vehicles with RPG-7 rocket-propelled grenade launchers, forcing the Iraqi troops to change tactics. The Iraqis then attacked again, advancing under deadly sniper fire, and the battle raged on around the deserted houses. The first victory cost them over 100 dead and close to 300 wounded. On September 24th, the 6th Armored Division continued to advance to the Zagros Mountains, supported by the 8th Infantry Division's infantrymen. The Iraqis aimed to neutralize Sarmast and Eslam Abad Garb to prevent a potential counterattack from the Iranian 81st Armored Division. They took control of the villages of Sar-e-Pol-e-Zahab and Gailan Zarb, but faced heavy gunfire from Pasdaran. The Iraqis waited for their artillery's arrival and eventually defeated the assailant. The 12th Armored Division crossed the border to Sumer, encountering unexpected resistance from military police and Pasdaran. After 36 hours of preparation, they overran the defenders and neutralized isolated areas of resistance. The Iranian chieftains took advantage of the terrain, harried the assailant, and took control of Mehran. On September 25th, the Iraqis continued moving forward, focusing on Elam, a strategically significant town with an important radar station. The Iranian Ans dispatched their 81st Armored Division's reconnaissance battalion to defend Elam before Iraqi troops arrived. The rest of the 81st Armored Division remained in Kermanshah to fill out its ranks, repair tanks, and wait for orders from military high command. The Iranian senior officers had studied tank combat with the Israelis and learned from Zahal's mistakes during the Yom Kippur War. The arrival of these reinforcements went undetected by the 2nd Infantry Division's command, which had no efficient means of collecting intelligence. In the 1980 Iraqi-Iraq War, the Iraqi infantrymen faced relentless attacks from Iranian Cobra helicopters and Scorpion tanks. The division commanders, who were confident in their strength, decided to establish a defensive position instead of seeking tank and artillery backup. The 2nd Infantry Division's tanks were slowed by Iranian Cobra attacks, and the Iraqis lost 40 T-55 tanks. On September 30th, they seized Deloran and took control of surrounding oil fields. The Iraqi leaders aimed to discourage the rural population from returning to this crucial sector of the front and annex it. On September 22, 1980, Iraqi armored and mechanized divisions entered Khuzestan, crossing the border near Kuwait and heading for Musian. The division chief had to put his brigades in single file along the road, leading by a reconnaissance regiment. The Iraqi tanks were particularly vulnerable to Cobra helicopter ambushes, which turned the Karkay River into a vast hunting ground. The division's commander called in Iraqi combat troops to limit losses and accelerate progress. These troops, including heavily armed Mi-24S and Gazelles equipped with 20mm guns, escorted the division and scouted as it progressed, regularly engaging in combat with the Iranian Cobras. On September 28, the 10th Armored Division crossed the Karkay River and established a bridgehead, allowing it to join the 1st Mechanized Division. The division then moved to Shush, where they encountered Iraqi helicopters in a vast agricultural plain. The Iraqi tanks attacked Shush, defending it from the rear and linking up with the 10th Armored Division's tanks. The Iranian survivors eventually surrendered, but the bridgehead was counterattacked by the 283rd Reconnaissance Battalion Scorpions and the 92nd Armored Division's 2nd Chieftain Brigade. The Iraqi artillery was unleashed, pushing back the Iraqi tanks. The 9th Armored Division reached its provisional objectives, splitting into 3 columns. The first column reached Awaz, crossing the Karun River without risking attack. The second column rushed to Susangerd and took control of Hamidiya, then Bozorg. The third column left Hoviza and ran into the 92nd Division's 1st Brigade, slowing it down with backup from Cobras. The Iranian tank commanders avoided a full-on confrontation, relying on artillery and gazelles armed with hot anti-tank missiles. At the end of the first week of operations, the 9th Armored Division had enough troops, munitions, fuel or water to launch an assault on Khuzestan. The division's lines of communication were stretched to the limit, and its logistics had fallen behind. An immediate attack would have been suicidal, as Khuzestan was solidly defended by the rest of the 92nd Armored Division, significant artillery, and Revolutionary Guards. On the first day of the war, the 3rd Armored Division, reinforced by the 5th Mechanized Division's 26th Tank Brigade, took control of the Shalamche border post, allowing Iraqi engineers to build a pontoon bridge across the Shatt al-Arab River. The Iraqi leadership's goal was to destroy the world's largest refinery and Taraz, the partially deserted city, to punish Tehran. The Iranian artillery struck back by pounding the Iraqi port of Al-Fao. The 3rd Division launched a concentric attack on Khorramshahr, aiming to divide the city and establish a bridgehead toward Abadan. The Iranians fought doggedly, repelling the assailant with RPG-7 fire, magnetic anti-tank mines, and Molotov cocktails. The Iraqis eventually retreated after losing the equivalent of 1 tank battalion and 1 mechanized battalion. On September 28, 1980, Saddam Hussein realized that his army's progress was slower than planned and proposed a ceasefire. He ordered a unilateral truce for the first week of October, but Iran's response was not long in coming. On September 30th, the Iraqi government listed unacceptable conditions for talks, including Saddam Hussein's resignation, the Iraqi regime's recognition of its role as the aggressor, Basra's control until Iraq paid off its war debt, and a referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan. The Iran-Iraq War was a result of conflicting ambitions between Saddam Hussein and Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who believed the survival of their regime relied on the destruction or weakening of the other. The rivalry between the Arabs and Persians over the Middle East's Fertile Crescent, once known as Mesopotamia, took on a religious connotation in the early 16th century. The Ottomans and Persians faced off along a fault line, and the power struggle took on a religious connotation. In 1534, Sultan Sulayman the Magnificent conquered Baghdad and signed the Treaty of Amasia, which stabilized the border between the Persian and Ottoman empires. However, the Banu Kab tribal chief defied the Shah and renamed the area Arabistan, creating more friction with the Ottoman Empire. The Sublime Porte imposed Amir Ashraf's treaty in 1727, which committed to no longer interfering in Arabistan's affairs. In 1843, a mixed Anglo-Russian commission delimited the Persian-Ottoman border from Mount Ararat to the Arab-Persian Gulf, sanctioned by the Treaty of Erzurum in 1847. The Ottomans retained Iraq and the entire Shatt al-Arab region but had to surrender the mountainous foothills between Mehran and Kasr-e-Shirin. The First World War turned this careful construction upside down, with the British occupying Basra and advancing toward Baghdad. By the end of the war, the British were the masters of Iraq, consolidating their position through the Sykes-Picot Agreement. London controlled Baghdad due to significant oil deposits in Kirkuk and Mosul. In 1930, King Faisal reaffirmed Iraqi sovereignty over the Shatt al-Arab, while Shah of Iran Reza Pahlavi demanded shared sovereignty over the river. After negotiations moderated by the British, the Iraqis and Iraq agreed on a new treaty in Tehran in 1937, recognizing the overall validity of the Constantinople Protocol, but establishing a narrow stretch of the Shatt al-Arab border along the Thalway. Iraq conserved a monopoly on piloting along the river. The Second World War modified the geopolitical landscape, with the Americans replacing the British as Iran's sponsors and the Soviets being forced to evacuate the country's northern part. The new Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, asserted a pro-Western line and imposed himself as one of the most influential leaders in the Middle East. The Cold War invited itself into the Middle East, and the Kremlin multiplied overtures and arms deliveries to Baghdad, where the Ba'ath Party, or Renewal Party, took power. Saddam Hussein, born in 1937, was a native of Tikrit and joined a clandestine cell of the Ba'ath Party. He became an intermediary between the Syrian and Iraqi branches of the party, gaining trust from General al-Bakr. In 1964, he was arrested during a sweep to eliminate the party's leaders, deepening his revolutionary knowledge and becoming fascinated with Stalin's writings. In 1968, Hassan al-Banna appointed Saddam Hussein as Deputy Secretary General of the Ba'ath Party, making him the party's number 2 man. He continued to strive for absolute power, involving himself in the appointment of head of the regime's security services. With the support of his clan, immediate family and those in debt, Saddam Hussein eliminated his rivals and took control of Baghdad. He trusted his mentor, Tariq Aziz, and became head of the People's Army. Saddam Hussein decided to bridle the army, putting it under political control to quell insurrectionary leans. The Shah of Iran saw an opportunity to take action, denouncing the 1937 Treaty of Tehran, and decreeing that the Iran-Iraq river border would run down the middle of the Shatt al-Arab. Baghdad refuted this claim and reaffirmed Iraqi sovereignty over the entire river. In the late 1960s, there were 3 million Kurds in Iraq, who made up close to 20% of the population, and occupied a strategically important area. General al-Bakr launched a military campaign against the Peshmergas, but faced resistance from Kurdish fighters. Saddam Hussein saw this situation as an opportunity to reinforce his personal power and undertake economic and social reforms. He negotiated with Mustafa Barzani, gaining his favor on all fronts. On March 11, 1970, Saddam granted the Kurds autonomous status, recognizing their cultural and linguistic identity, significant local administrative power, and bringing 5 Kurdish ministers into his government. In December 1971, the British government withdrew from the Gulf region to save money and focus on containing Iran's regional ambitions. The United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Bahrain joined Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq on the front lines in attempting to contain Iran's regional ambitions. Iran took advantage of the opportunity to seize 3 small islands, Abu Musa and the Greater and Lesser Tums, controlling access to the Strait of Hormuz, which had consistently risen since 2/3 of the Middle East's oil production had begun passing through it. The British government preferred to see the islands come into the hands of Iran, a reliable ally to the West. The American government openly banked on the Shah and promised significant military assistance to Iran, turning the country into a true regional power. The White House shipped vast quantities of weapons, including Tomcat interceptors equipped with the formidable Phoenix missile, and trained Iranian military students in the United States. Washington also embarked on a civil nuclear cooperation program with Tehran and promised to deliver the Shah several fully operational weapon factories. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein sought to get his country out of diplomatic isolation to counter Iran and Israel. He conceived a 3-step maneuver to attain this goal, reconciling with the Soviet Union and strengthening relationships with Europe. He presented himself as the Arabs' natural shield from Iranian imperialism in the Gulf and the Near East, and sent part of his army to fight the Israelis on the Golan Heights during the Yom Kippur War. Saddam Hussein nationalized the oil industry and put 2 offshore oil terminals in service, increasing oil production and making Iraq a major player within the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, and a serious rival to Iran on the energy front. Iraq's situation worsened due to Saddam Hussein's failure to implement the promised autonomous status for the Kurds, and the Iraqi regime's plan to force Arabization of the 2 principal Kurdish cities, Mosul and Kirkuk. In 1974, Mustafa Barzani mobilized troops and called for an independent Kurdistan, with Kirkuk as the capital. The Peshmergas went underground, threatening to put a hold on Mosul and Kirkuk. The US and Israel supported the Kurdish rebels, financing, arming, and training them. The Iraqi army struggled to resist, and the Shah sent Iranian soldiers disguised as Peshmergas to participate in hostilities. The Iraqi government realized the civil war was costing it and preventing modernization. The US feared tension between Iran and Iraq would influence the Kremlin, and the Soviet Union remained silent. Israel wanted the fighting to continue, as it had the advantage of simultaneously occupying and weakening the Iraqi army. In 1975, Iraq and Iran agreed to negotiate under Algerian President Houari Boumediene, who held the rotating presidency of the group of non-aligned states. They agreed to delineate their terrestrial border, based on the 1913 Constantinople Protocol, drawing down the middle of the Shatt al-Arab. In exchange, the Shah withdrew support for the Kurdish rebellion. Saddam Hussein felt humiliated and decided to reverse the power dynamic and create conditions for a repeal of the Algiers Accord. He used Iraq's oil wealth to launch a policy of major public works and accelerate economic and social reforms, allowing the middle class to improve its living conditions. Saddam Hussein also tightened his hold on Iraqi society and reined in the army. He appointed himself as a general and entrusted the Ministry of Defense to his first cousin, Abadan. He founded a corps of young officers devoted to the regime and purged the army of individuals perceived as rebellious. In 1978, a plot was brought to light within the army, and major arms deals were signed with the Soviet Union and France to provide Iraq with modern weapons. Saddam Hussein also sought rapprochement with the Gulf oil monarchies and created the illusion of a peaceful relationship with the Shah of Iran. Relations between Baghdad and Tehran had been cordial since the signing of the Algiers Accord, and Prince Ghulam made an official visit to Iraq, underscoring the two countries' apparent reconciliation. In 1979, protests in Iran escalated, leading to the ouster of the Shah and the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini, an aging and sick Shah, decided to leave the country to prevent civil war. He embarked on a pathetic exile, traveling from Egypt to Morocco and the Bahamas to Mexico. Prime Minister Shapur Bakhtiar tried to regain control, but the mob wanted a real change of regime and called for opposition forces to unite. Khomeini, a grandson and son of Ayatollahs, became involved in the opposition to the Shah's regime, criticizing its westernization policy and advocating for the adoption of Sharia law. His political commitment put him at loggerheads with the government. In 1964 he was forced into exile, sent to Turkey and Iraq, where he spent the next 14 years denouncing the Shah's regime and facilitating rapprochement between the Iraqi Shiites and the Iranian clergy. Ayatollah Khomeini's proselytism deeply bothered the Iraqi authorities, particularly Saddam Hussein. In France, he was kept under surveillance and continued his policy of destabilizing the regime through preaching and audio cassettes. His portrait spread throughout major Iranian cities, making him the most visible opponent to the Shah's regime. On February 5, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini proclaimed himself the supreme leader of the revolution and dismissed Shapur Bakhtiar. The army declared its neutrality and committed to serving the new regime, leading to chaos and a second oil crisis. In late February, Ayatollah Khomeini appointed Mehdi Bazargan as prime minister. Mehdi Bazargan, the head of the Iranian Republic's provisional government, sought to reconcile religion and modernity by integrating democratic and liberal principles in a moderate Islamic framework. He adopted an egalitarian social policy and massively subsidized agricultural revenue to gain support from the disinherited. However, his lack of charisma made him difficult to establish himself in the shadow of Ayatollah Khomeini, who enjoyed a real cult of personality. On April 2, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini proclaimed the Islamic Republic of Iran and charged a commission of jurists with writing a new constitution. The purges accelerated, leading to thousands of people being arrested and at least 200 executed. Many imperial laws were repealed, leading to massive emigration among the wealthier layers of society. Many military professionals chose to desert and go into exile in the West, while insurgent forces took advantage of the chaos to try and grapple with certain provinces' autonomy from the central authorities. To re-establish order, Ayatollah Khomeini decided to create a parallel army entirely devoted to the regime, the Pasdaran-e-Enqilab, or Revolutionary Guards. The corps was divided into three principal commands, one for protecting Tehran, defending major provincial cities, and guarding borders. To preserve the balance between secular and religious soldiers, and ensure heterogeneous recruitment, the authorities allowed young people to choose between the regular army or the Pasdaran Corps. The Iranian society divided into two camps during the revolution: the progressive camp, which considered revolutionary issues and republican principles to outweigh the religious dimension, and the minority camp, which focused on the Islamic dimension and considered the revolutionary phase as a transitional stage toward establishing a real theocracy. Saddam Hussein, a 42-year-old Iraqi leader, was determined to be faithful to the new Iranian regime and eliminate his potential rivals within the party. He took power in Baghdad on July 16, 1979, with the support of his clan members. He appointed his cousin Ali Hassan al-Majid as head of intelligence, and promoted his friend Tariq Aziz to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Saddam Hussein used intimidation methods to establish himself as the new strongman in the region. He used falsely debonair appearances to create an image of a paternalistic and pitiless leader, combining the personalities of Stalin and Al Capone. He also shared traits with Stalin, such as modest backgrounds, maternal violence, education struggles, and suspicion of intellectuals and doctors. Saddam Hussein ordered his cousin Adnan Khairallah to purge the military of officers loyal to General al-Bakr, fearing a military coup d'état. He forced every lieutenant who graduated from the academy to pledge their allegiance and insisted on meeting every senior officer to evaluate their loyalty before being promoted. Promotions were now made on a periodic basis, and he developed a culture of personality by creating flattering portraits displaying his carnivorous smile, and commissioned the production of a film called Al-Qadisiyah. As a wild beast of the political arena, Saddam Hussein intuitively sensed menaces and foresaw that he would soon have to confront Ayatollah Khomeini, whose vindictive speeches did not leave much ambiguity regarding his desire to bring down the Iraqi government. The two regimes' goals were too contradictory, and Saddam Hussein could coexist with the Shah but could not do so with Ayatollah Khomeini. After the Iran-Iraq War, rumors emerged that the U.S. government had incited Saddam Hussein to attack Iran, threatening Washington's political backing and material assistance. The allegation was that the U.S. had acted to avoid the spread of the Islamic Revolution to Gulf monarchies, particularly to punish the Iranian regime implicated in the hostage crisis. This rumor stemmed from statements made by Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, who accused the U.S. of inciting Iraq to attack Iran and claiming that the Iraqi regime would have been unable to go on the offensive without Washington's support. In 1985, Saudi Arabia leaked statements supporting Bani Sadr's claims to the British press, including Jimmy Carter's government inciting Saddam Hussein to action, and pressured King Khalid to encourage him to launch the crusade against Khomeini and promise him the oil monarchy's financial backing. The Iraqi president was alleged to have traveled to Riyadh on August 5, 1980, at the king's request, to be told he could count on American support. However, the theory does not bear scrutiny. As early as 1988, Paul Balta, Le Monde's correspondent in the Middle East, wrote that there is no real evidence to support the theory that Washington pushed Baghdad to open hostilities. Since then, a meticulous analysis of the events, context, and statements by contemporary authorities, combined with more recent sources and interviews, has left no doubt that the American government did not push Saddam Hussein to criminal behavior. The American administration, analyzing world affairs through the lens of the Cold War, considered Iraq an ally of the Soviet Union and a potential adversary. It identified three threats to security in the Gulf: the USSR, Iran, and Iraq. Ba'athist socialist theories were considered contrary to American diplomats' principles, particularly in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein was deemed impossible to manipulate, and nobody trusted him, and his hostility toward Israel and his nuclear program discredited him in the eyes of Congress, the White House, and powerful go-betweens Israel strategically kept in Washington. The Islamic Revolution muddied the waters. In the months that followed the Islamic Revolution, everyone in Washington tried to absolve themselves of failing to anticipate the Shah's downfall. The establishment was divided between those who wanted to rebuild a partnership with Tehran and those who criticized the administration for its disastrous handling of the Iranian crisis. The general mood was rendered more poisonous by the fact that many believed the KGB had played a decisive role in sparking the Iranian Revolution as a first step to a major Soviet offensive in the Gulf region. The situation could move forward without direct dialogue between the supreme leader and top American decision-makers. In August, Iran canceled its arms contracts with the United States, leading to a drop in oil revenue and an embargo on the delivery of spare parts promised to the Iranian army. In late October, Zbigniew Brzezinski met Mehdi Bazargan in Algiers, granting Mohammad Reza Pahlavi the right of asylum. The population reacted furiously when it learned that the Shah had arrived on American soil, accompanied by rumors that a secret meeting had occurred between their prime minister and a high-ranking American emissary. In November 1979, demonstrators in Tehran took American diplomats hostage, leading to a panic among the U.S. administration. Ayatollah Khomeini publicly supported the hostage-takers and dismantled Mehdi Bazargan's government. He also instituted the Basij, a corps of Revolutionary Guards, which would serve as a reserve force for the Pasdaran. The U.S. administration was thrown into a panic, losing its remaining contacts in the Iranian government. President Carter froze Iranian assets in American banks and decreed an embargo on weapons shipments to Iran. He ordered American technicians living in Iran and maintaining American equipment there to return to the U.S. However, he refused to break off diplomatic ties with Tehran and trusted the State Department to resolve the hostage crisis peacefully. The situation became more complicated when fundamentalist pilgrims held hundreds of worshippers hostage in Mecca, calling to fight the corruption of the Saudi state and denouncing its compromises with the American government. This tragedy sounded the alarm for the Gulf monarchies, who revived their old anti-Shiite demons to attract Ayatollah Khomeini's vituperations. The Soviet army staged a surprise invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979, causing tensions in the region. The Gulf monarchs were concerned about the Soviets coming dangerously closer to their oil wells, and the Iranian revolutionaries were nervous. President Carter hesitated to use force to liberate the American hostages, fearing that a military intervention would push Iran into the Soviets' arms. In response, President Carter sent 30 naval vessels into the Gulf of Oman, establishing the Middle East Task Force to protect it from any attempt at Iranian or Soviet destabilization. However, the Carter Doctrine did not impress those in power in Iran, who were more concerned with internal struggles dividing the regime. The progressive camp in Iran, weakened after Mehdi Bazargan's dismissal, relied on socialists and left-wing Muslims to stop the Islamic Republican Party, or IRP, from taking over. Ayatollah Khomeini remained above the fray, moving his pawns and playing people off each other to secure his function as an arbiter. The clergy's ultra-conservative members objected to the establishment of the Islamic Republic, considering it improper for man to take God's place in deciding upon the arrival of the true Islamic Revolution. On the opposite pole of the political spectrum, the urban extreme left contested the regime's religious character and demanded the founding of a Marxist republic. In this merciless power struggle, the clergy could count on the supreme leader, the Assembly of Experts, and the Council of Guardians of the Revolution, while the secular camp relied on the President of the Republic and the Parliament. In January 1980, Abul Hassan was elected President of the Republic, appointed by Ayatollah Beheshti, the Secretary General of the IRP, as head of the Council of Guardians of the Revolution. Negotiations between Washington and Tehran collapsed due to a lack of drive on the Iranian side and lack of consistency on the American side. Jimmy Carter broke off diplomatic relations with Iran on April 7, 1980, and decided to use force to rescue hostages. The White House chose a clandestine operation carried out by Army Special Forces and the CIA Operation Eagle Claw, which involved 8 Sea Stallion helicopters flying to an ad hoc landing strip called Desert One. The operation came apart quickly, with 2 helicopters forced to turn back and the others barely making it to Desert One. The Iranian government, led by President Bani Sadr, saw the American disaster as an opportunity to score points against radical clergy and strengthen national cohesion. They sent Admiral Ahmad Madani to Khuzestan as governor, and adopted aggressive rhetoric towards the Iraqi regime, with support from Ayatollah Khomeini. The American administration remained obsessed with the hostage crisis, fearing that a war between Iran and Iraq could only slow their liberation. The White House preferred the status quo between Baghdad and Tehran over a war that could have a boomerang effect. The CIA and Pentagon were involved in discreet negotiations with Iranian authorities to trade the hostages' freedom for the delivery of spare parts, despite the embargo decreed by Congress. The intelligence community concluded that Iraq had sufficient resources to launch a large-scale attack on Iran, but did not imagine a real war could be in the offing. The State Department recommended evacuation of American employees working in Iraq as a precautionary measure and gathering in Kuwait. Some members of Carter's entourage suggested warning the Iranians to speed up a potential resolution to the hostage crisis. The onset of hostilities between Iraq and Iran upset the agendas of President Carter and his advisors, who were focused on winning the presidential election and resolving the hostage crisis. Polls predicted Republican candidate Ronald Reagan would win by a wide margin. In a briefing to reporters at the White House, Carter declared that there should be absolutely no interference by any other nation and announced the deployment of missile cruiser Leahy to the Gulf and 4 AWACS aerial surveillance planes to Saudi Arabia. In October 1980, the Carter administration resumed contact with the Iranian regime, offering to deliver spare parts, restitute the Shah's belongings, and lift the freeze on Iran assets in exchange for the liberation of hostages before the presidential election. Iranian authorities rejected the American offer but left the door open for negotiation, relying on Ronald Reagan to win the election. On November 4, 1980, Ronald Reagan won the election by a landslide, and on January 20th, Tehran liberated the first 2 American hostages after 444 days of captivity. The Iranian regime claimed to be showing goodwill and displaying its intention to rebuild its relations with Washington. In mid-January, the Iranians and Americans agreed on an agreement in principle, signed on January 19, 1981, in Algiers. In exchange for the hostages' liberation, Washington returned $8 billion of Iranian assets frozen in the United States and committed to delivering $480 million worth of spare parts for the Iranians' tanks and aircraft. The Soviet leaders were furious not to have been consulted by Saddam Hussein, who had been considered one of their best allies in the area. They analyzed the war through the prism of the Cold War, and agreed with the White House to contain the conflict within its regional dimension. After Egypt's turn to the Western camp, the Iranian Islamic Revolution, and the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union recognized their unpopularity in the Middle East. Minister of Foreign Affairs Andrei Gromyko and Chairman of the KGB Yuri Andropov proposed to distance themselves from Iraq and draw closer to Iran, underlining the Iranian regime's anti-American rhetoric and the importance of the Iranian Communist Party. They also insisted on the necessity for the Soviet Union to make ties with polite Islam, to weaken the Mujahideen's resistance in Afghanistan, and cool the Soviet Muslim Republic's desire for independence. Party ideologue Mikhail Suslov was torn between supporting the Iraqi Ba'ath Party's secular and progressive theories and his empathy for the Kurdish people mistreated by the same party. Marshal Dmitry Ustinov defended the Iraqi Alliance, emphasizing that it would be disastrous to support Iran and drop Iraq since Moscow armed Baghdad. Leonid Brezhnev, the party's Secretary General, decided to preserve diplomatic relations with Baghdad and maintain 1,200 advisors assisting the Iraqi army. He ordered an immediate end to all weapon deliveries to Iraq and the freezing of any contracts under negotiation, notably those relating to the delivery of the powerful MiG-25s. The Soviet ambassador to Tehran, Vladimir Vinogradov, met the Iranian Prime Minister to inform him of the Kremlin's offer to provide assistance as a means to cement new relations between the two nations. The Iranian authorities made contact with Moscow again in 1981, saying they were ready to accept Soviet military assistance, so long as it remained secret and did not require any political compensation. In 1981, Moscow decided to discreetly help Iraq through the intervention of other socialist countries, providing hardy weapons from the abundant stockpiles of the Warsaw Pact. Iraq received 500 T-55 and T-62 tanks, 850 armored vehicles, and several tens of thousands of light weapons from Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. However, Iraq did not directly receive any weapons from the Soviet Union. This was done to pressure Saddam Hussein to withdraw his forces to the international border and hasten the conflict's resolution. China was also unnerved by the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War, feared that Congress would allow Washington and Moscow to improve their positions in the region. President Deng Xiaoping thought China had to support Iraq to weaken the Soviet position in the area. He was ready to discreetly arm Baghdad to wrestle Iraq from the Soviet sphere of influence and collect precious currency. China's government's position could be summarized by three priorities: containing the Soviet Union, conquering new markets, and maintaining the balance between the belligerents. China's military mission traveled to Baghdad to evaluate the Iraqi army's needs, and the first arms and ammunition freighters left China in late 1980 and arrived in Iraq in 1981. The French government faced a dilemma in preserving its arms trade and industrial cooperation with Iraq without breaking with Iran. The French government's support for Iraq was seen as crucial to its economic and industrial interests, but it was also concerned that overly clear support for Iraq would provoke violent reactions in Iran. The French military high command responded by reinforcing its naval presence in the Gulf, deploying guided missile frigates Suffren and Izere to join the Abassos Schulcher and Bouvet. France's commitment to Baghdad can be traced back decades before the war, when General de Gaulle welcomed his Iraqi counterpart in Paris. Despite Iraq's close ties to the USSR, initial contacts were fruitful, with Panhard selling armored cars to the Iraqi army and Berliet and Saviem delivering military trucks. In 1972, the Iraqi government announced the nationalization of the Iraqi oil industry, and negotiations proceeded smoothly. Saddam Hussein visited France to finalize conditions for petroleum cooperation between France and Iraq, promising French companies would be the last to be nationalized. The French oil industry launched a press campaign supporting the Iraqi regime, pressured by the government to accept Saddam's request. In 1972, the French and Iraqi governments signed an agreement to preserve French oil interests in Iraq for 10 years. The CFP was entitled to buy as much oil as it wanted at extremely advantageous prices. The National Company for Aerospace Industry committed to delivering 102 helicopters to Iraq, while Dassault delivered 3 ultra-modern Mystère 20 liaison planes. Panhard sent 194 light armored vehicles. Brandt sold Iraq 580 mortars with 420,000 shells, and the Omsan CSF was charged with modernizing Iraq's anti-aircraft defense network with 6 highly reliable radars. Cooperation between the two countries reached new heights with the election of President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and the nomination of Prime Minister Jacques Chirac. Chirac was won over by Saddam Hussein's personality and brought home more than $3 billion worth of contracts. An initial contract covering the sale of 40 Mirage F-1S was signed, calling for delivery in late 1980. French and Iraqi delegations met several times over the course of 1975 to negotiate the terms of nuclear cooperation. Paris offered to deliver enriched uranium to Baghdad and build an 800-kilowatt research reactor, as well as a 70-megawatt nuclear power station called Osirak. The agreement on civil nuclear power removed the last restrictions preventing the sale of the most sensitive materials to Iraq. From 1976 to 1979, French weapon manufacturers had a field day selling Iraq everything its army needed and could not get from the Soviets. Military cooperation accelerated with the signing of several bilateral agreements covering the training of students and technicians responsible for putting the Mirages and helicopters in service. The Franco-Iranian dispute began in 1974 when France committed to selling Iran several civil nuclear power stations and proposed that Tehran invest in the construction of the Eurodif uranium enrichment plant. The French government, as a leader in the nuclear field, convinced the Shah Reza Pahlavi to massively invest his petrodollars. In December 1974, the Shah granted France a $1 billion loan in exchange for Iran's 10% share in Eurodif's capital. This investment would allow Iran to buy 10% of the enriched uranium produced by the Tricastin plant once it began operating in 1981. The French Atomic Energy Commission, or CEA, and its Iranian counterpart founded Sofidif to manage nuclear cooperation between the two nations. However, the cooperation process dragged on, and the situation in Iran deteriorated rapidly. In 1979, the new Islamic government denounced the nuclear cooperation contract with France, suspending current payments and demanding reimbursement of the $1 billion Eurodif loan granted by the Shah. Paris categorically refused to reimburse the loan and opposed Iran's prerogative to exercise its rights as a Eurodif shareholder. The situation worsened when an Iraqi commando unit headed by Anis Nakache was captured on July 18, 1980. following a failed assassination attempt on Shapur Bakhtiar. The French government emphasized the necessity of protecting its energy supply sources and the moral obligation to support the only progressive state in the area that could contain the Islamic Revolution's dangerous proselytism. The Iranian government took advantage of the Tricastin nuclear power plant's opening to claim its right to 10% of the enriched uranium produced and demanded the reimbursement of the Eurodif loan. In late September 1980, the European Economic Community, or EEC, faced a crisis in the Gulf, with principal EEC powers struggling to agree on a common strategy. The EEC declared that freedom of navigation in the Gulf was crucial for EEC's security and defense policies. The EEC was more dependent on oil from the Arabian Peninsula than the Americans, making them more vulnerable to destabilization. To secure energy supplies and protect commercial relations with oil monarchies, EEC leaders opposed a United Nations embargo on arms sales to countries in the region. They also knew that continued sale of military equipment would benefit their weapons industries. European leaders focused on macroeconomic indicators, such as British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's strict neutrality and Germany's Chancellor Helmut Schmidt's strict neutrality. The British government imposed two strict rules regarding military matters. Contracts signed before the war would be honored, but the sale of equipment likely to significantly increase either side's military capacities was banned. The Islamic Republic became the UK's biggest customer in the Middle East after Saudi Arabia. German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt adopted a posture of strict neutrality referring to the German constitution, which prevented him from involving his country in armed conflict. He discreetly supplied Tehran with military equipment including Mercedes trucks, tanks, transport trailers, and small arms munitions manufactured by the Werner Company. However, negotiations over the sale of ultra-modern Type 209 submarines failed due to pressure from Washington, Paris, and Riyadh. German authorities managed to maintain cordial relations with Baghdad, despite the hostility the Ba'athist regime unleashed towards those supporting its adversaries. They sold everything the Iraqis were ready to buy, including Mercedes for the regime's elite machine tools, and chemical components for engineers responsible for developing weapons of mass destruction. Germany also sold 60 Bo-105 attack helicopters equipped with devastating hot anti-tank missiles to Iraq via Spain, allowing Germany to display its neutrality vis-à-vis the two belligerents. Italy tried to preserve its commercial ties with Iraq and Iran, with President Francesco Cossiga declaring neutrality and ensuring that contracts signed before the war would be honored. However, Cossiga's downfall and subsequent coalitions forced him to ban all weapons sales to the belligerents. Spain and Greece, both dependent on Middle Eastern oil, refused to take sides with either of the belligerents, but provided them with arms and ammunition to collect revenue. Spain and Greece also sold Iraq light weapons, recoilless anti-tank guns, and Santana Land Rovers, and handled the sale of Bo-105 helicopters contracted with Germany. Scandinavian countries, like the Benelux nations, condemned Iraq and Iran for drawing each other into a stupid and criminal conflict, but also signed lucrative contracts with one or both belligerents. Overall, European countries delivered $27 billion worth of military equipment to Iraq and Iran, making up a quarter of their weapon purchases. The Iran-Iraq War was a complex conflict that required Arab leaders to decide on their stance, as it was not based on the East-West conflict, Israeli-Arab conflict, or decolonization wars. The Arab world was divided along several fault lines, including conservative monarchies versus progressive republics, secular regimes versus Islamic regimes, pro-Western states versus pro-Soviet states, states willing to hold discussions with Israel versus those belonging to the refusal front, and rich countries versus poor. Arab leaders took positions based on their interests, bilateral relations with Baghdad and Tehran, and rivalries, with some harboring ambitions to impose their leadership on the Arab-speaking world. However, they agreed on avoiding the conflict from developing into a region-wide war that could potentially degenerate into a military conflict between the Americans and the Soviets. King Hussein of Jordan, who had a strong pragmatism, unreservedly sided with Saddam Hussein on September 23, 1980. He evoked Arab solidarity but also acted as a realpolitiker, providing Jordan with military assistance, allowing Iraqi fighter pilots to train in his airspace, and allowing Iraqi engineers to examine his Hawk air defense missiles. His unstinting commitment to Iraq allowed him to reap extensive economic benefits, such as transforming Aqaba into a prosperous harbor zone and improving the road network. King Hassan II of Morocco and President Habib Bourguiba of Tunisia supported Saddam Hussein in the Maghreb for different reasons. Moroccan King Hassan II supported Iraq due to its religious and liturgical might and Algeria's sympathy for Iran. President Bourguiba saw Ba'athist Iraq as a model for a secular Arab society and a barrier against Iran's religious fanaticism. King Khalid of Saudi Arabia also supported Saddam, but with less enthusiasm. He wanted to back Iraq as a natural barrier to the Iranian regime's aggressive proselytism. Khalid's ideal solution would have been a permanent status quo between the two belligerents, reinforcing his financial base and dominant position in OPEC. He wanted to implement a regional security structure centered around Saudi Arabia, which could allow him to resolve the Yemenite conflict to his advantage. Khalid assured Saddam Hussein of his support and promised important loans to finance his war against Iran. He guaranteed Iraq the right of transit to bring in weapons purchased worldwide and provided delivery of merchandise to Iraq. He agreed to extract oil from the neutral zone on Iraq's behalf and sell 300,000 barrels of oil per day, would partially compensate Baghdad's loss of revenue. The oil monarchies were divided on their stance towards Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia in the Gulf conflict. Emir Jabir III of Kuwait and Emir Isa of Bahrain were reluctant to openly support Baghdad, fearing that Saddam would exploit the situation and destabilize the region. They reaffirmed their opposition to foreign troops and offered financial and logistical support to Iraq. Kuwait became Iraq's largest sponsor, paying Baghdad $9 billion from 1981 to 1988. Sheikh Khalifa Al Thani of Qatar aligned with Saudi Arabia and supported Saddam Hussein, but only provided nominal financial backing. Sheikh Zayed of Abu Dhabi sided with Baghdad out of Arab solidarity, but maintained cordial relations with Tehran. Sultan Qaboos of Oman took the most reserved position, refusing to take sides with either belligerents and offering his services as a mediator. Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat had no choice but to verbally support Iraq out of hatred for the Iranian regime, fearing that Iran's victory could reinforce the Muslim Brotherhood movement and destabilize his regime. After his assassination by the Tanzim al-Jihad, Hosni Mubarak began providing material support to Saddam Hussein, including spare parts for his weapons munitions tanks and Su-7 fighter bombers. He also agreed to have several tens of thousands of Egyptians join the Iraqi army for the duration of the hostilities in return for a good salary. Mubarak's efforts led to Egypt rejoining the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in 1984, and later returning to the head of the Arab League. Algerian President Houari Boumediene had good reasons to support Iran and Iraq, both countries expressing their desire for independence and modernity, and turning their backs on the West. Algerian authorities did not want to enter into conflict with either side, and aspired to recognize Algeria as a credible mediator capable of bringing greater stability to the Middle East. However, he was determined to secretly help Iran, due to several grudges he had against Saddam Hussein. Syria President Hafez al-Assad immediately rallied behind Tehran, respecting the alliance he had made with the Iranian regime a year earlier. Syria had openly been in the Arab camp, both out of solidarity and self-interest. and needed material assistance from Arab countries to maintain pressure on the Jewish state and supply the Palestinian resistance. After Saddam Hussein came to power in 1979, Hafez al-Assad found himself isolated in the heart of the Arab world and turned to Iran, which appeared to be the only regional power able to put sufficient pressure on the three countries most threatening to his security: Israel, Turkey, and Iraq. The Iranian clergy, who wanted to export the Islamic Revolution, believed that its destabilizing action had to primarily be aimed at Iraq in order to constitute a new Shiite axis made up of Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Hafez al-Assad, a former Iraqi leader, saw Saddam Hussein as a ruthless rival and decided to provide military assistance to Tehran during the hostilities between Iran and Iraq. He ordered the delivery of missiles, munitions, and other Soviet-made light equipment to complement what Iraqis captured from the Iraqis. Syria also provided Iran with pharmaceutical and food products and allowed it to deploy several hundred Pasdaran in Lebanon, giving Iran a foothold in the land of the Cedar and an opportunity to tighten its grip on the Lebanese Shiite community. In return, they helped the Syrian dictator rout militias hostile to Damascus. Assad launched an army against the Muslim Brotherhood forces in Hama in February 1982, resulting in 30,000 deaths and a third of the city destroyed. To weaken Baghdad and please Tehran, Assad opened his borders to Iraqi Kurd leaders trying to escape Saddam's secret police. He even ordered terrorist attacks on Iraqi interests in Lebanon. Muammar Gaddafi, the leader of the Libyan Revolution, had long sought revenge on Saddam Hussein and allied himself with the Syrians. He offered the Syrian president a merger between Libyan Jamahiriya and the Syrian Republic, but was forced to support Tehran with Assad. In 1981, Iran took advantage of South Yemen's poor economic situation to punish Saddam Hussein for supporting North Yemen. South Yemen's geostrategic position at the mouth of the Red Sea was valuable to Iran, as it allowed it to carry out attacks in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and harry maritime traffic. North Yemen's government allied with Iraq, and President Ali Abdullah Saleh committed to sending volunteers to fight on the Iraqi front. The Arab League's inability to react led to the signing of the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC, in 1981, which aimed to promote economic integration and promote a regional common market. The GCC was created to coordinate economic policies and counter Iran, and it was the first time the 6 Gulf monarchies united on a political calendar project. To avoid appearing dominated by Saudi Arabia, Abdullah Bishara was appointed Secretary General, but the Saudi monarch and UAE president pulled the strings of the GCC. Iran's provocations against Kuwait, considered the GCC's weak link, were used to express dismay and wariness. Israel has maintained strong ties with Iran since its founding, sharing their interest in containment of the Arab camp. Iran has always been the perfect rear ally for Israel, and Israel has purchased its oil supplies from Iran. The Israeli government considered it in its best interest to keep the channels between Jerusalem and Tehran open while waiting for the mullah's regime to collapse. Israel's position was largely shaped by its desire to undermine the Iraq regime, which was perceived as a more distant threat. Menachem Begin decided to support Tehran and supply the Iranians with discreet military assistance, aiming to prolong the conflict and gain from immobilizing and weakening 2 of its enemies. Additionally, Jerusalem had believed the Iranian Jews were in danger since the beginning of the Islamic Revolution, and wanted to bring as many as possible home to Israel. The Israeli government was reassured neither by the traditional protection enjoyed by the Iranian Jewish community, nor Ayatollah Khomeini's statements guaranteeing its safety. From 1980 to 1988, 55,000 Iranian Jews were authorized to leave Iran without fear of their lives. As negotiations between the two capitals stalled, Israel had to resume weapon shipments to unblock the situation. These arms sales allowed Israel to do a favor to the Americans, who were looking for intermediaries to deliver spare parts they had promised Iran. Over 6 years, from 1980 to 1986, Israel made between $1 and $2 billion from weapons and spare parts shipments to Iran, becoming the fourth biggest weapon supplier to Tehran. In 1986 alone, these sales allegedly reached the record of $750 million. The war allowed Israel to negotiate the repatriation of Iraqi Jews, collect revenue, and take a hardline position towards Syria and the Palestinians. The Israeli government opened discussions with the Iranian military authorities only a few days after the beginning of the war and offered them Israel's help. Jacob Nimrodi, the former Israeli military attaché to Tehran, attempted to re-establish contact with Iran and was responsible for suggesting what Israel could and could not deliver to Tehran to avoid creating a threat to its own security. The Iranian liaison between Iran's authorities and Jacob Nimrodi was military officials who had sworn allegiance to the Islamic regime. Turkey capitalized on the Iran-Iraq War to benefit economically and politically. The war began 10 days after the September 12, 1980, coup d'état that put the Turkish military in power. General Kenan Evren dissolved the National Assembly, banned political parties, and formed a government of liberal technocrats to put the Turkish economy back on track. Both belligerents saw Turkey as a country to be courted, and with which it would be dangerous to have an antagonistic relationship. From Baghdad's perspective, Turkey was a regional power that controlled one of the principal oil pipelines exporting Iraqi oil to the west, and regulated the flow of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, vital to Iraqi industry and agriculture. The Iraqi regime had two additional reasons to closely collaborate with Turkey. Ankara purchased a significant part of Iraq's oil production without challenging its conditions, and the two capitals were equally determined to fight the Kurdish independence movement. The Iranian perspective also crystallized based on mutual interests. Iran and Turkey share a mountainous border which had been stable for 3.5 centuries, to the benefit of local populations. Both nations had excellent reasons to cooperate with each other, such as conquering new markets, breaking isolation, and supplying affordable energy. On October 2, 1980, General Evren committed his country to a path of active neutrality, maintaining excellent relations with both belligerents without privileging either one. Over 5 years, the volume of Turkish exports to Iran grew 12-fold, increasing from $88.5 million in 1980 to over $1 billion in 1985. Turkey was Iran's leading commercial partner, with Iran absorbing a quarter of Turkey's exports. The collapse of oil prices beginning in 1985 only increased the belligerents' dependency on Turkey, allowing Turkey to claim the title of silent victor of the Iran-Iraq War. In September 1980, Iraq invaded Khuzestan, a province with a population that did not welcome the invasion as liberators. The invasion was met with suspicion and rage, with many inhabitants of Khuzestan having distant Arab roots. Nationalist feelings prevailed, with acts of violence against Arabic-speaking tribes committed by some Iraqi generals during the first days of the war. The spirit of resistance proved strong, rekindling national pride and demonizing any foreign intervention. Tens of thousands of volunteers rushed to sign up with the Revolutionary Guards, armed only with their goodwill and light weapons. Many young people left university to fight the Iraqis, learning to use weapons in the field where natural selection was brutal. Several notable figures emerged in the Revolutionary Guard's pantheon, such as Mohsen Rezai, Hossein Karazi, Rahim Safavi, and Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. These combatants were driven by the spirit of Valmy and believed it was necessary to march against the invader to save their nation. They did not understand the clergy's timidity and lack of commitment of clerics, which would fuel many political conflicts in the heart of Iran during and after the war. The resistance was driven by the spirit of Valmy, believing it was necessary to save their country and institutions. The Iraqi invasion of the Islamic Republic failed to lead to its downfall, but it reinforced and consolidated it, sealing the bond between the population and the regime. The Iranian authorities were quick to understand that this confrontation with a despised enemy would allow them to unite the population behind them. The regime was fighting 3 wars simultaneously, against radical opposition movements in major cities, independence movements in Kurdistan, Azerbaijan and Baluchistan, and the war between Iran and Iraq. Ayatollah Khomeini's priority was to defend the regime on the internal front, with President Bani Sadr and the army conducting the war against Iraq with the help of the Pasdaran, while Prime Minister Mohammad Ali Rajai found internal enemies with the support of the clergy and the most devoted members of the Revolutionary Guards and security services. The Iranian military high command used the unilateral truce decreed by Saddam Hussein to return its military layout, reinforcing the 3 sectors considered most vulnerable: cities of Andameshk and Dezful, the residential area around Awaz, and the ports of Khorramshahr and Abadan. The Iraqi military command also took advantage of this brief interlude to reinforce its layout in the Basra sector, ordering the 33rd Special Forces Brigade to Basra to prepare for an attack on Khorramshahr. The Iraqi generals made a big mistake by not occupying the city of Suzangard, which they had seized in the first days of the war. After crossing the city, their tanks immediately continued towards Awaz, leaving this strategic crossroads without a garrison. The city rose up early in October, and its authorities managed to gather several hundred combatants reinforced by a multitude of Pasdaran. On September 30, 1980, the Iranian government launched Operation Incandescent Sword, targeting the Osirak nuclear power plant southeast of Baghdad. The attack was aimed at neutralizing the Iraqi nuclear program, but Tehran's intelligence lacked reliable information. 4 Phantoms, armed with 6 500-pound bombs and an ALQ-101 electronic countermeasure pod, flew at low altitude to penetrate Iraqi airspace. The raid was successful, but the damage was minimal. The next day, 16 Phantoms returned to Baghdad, bombing government offices, Ba'ath Party headquarters, military headquarters, Republican Guard barracks, and Mukhabarat headquarters. The Iraqi counterattack was imminent, with 12 Su-20s straying from Kirkuk and destroying 3 Phantoms and damaging several others. The pilots managed to return home without any losses. On October 3rd, the Iraqi Air Force launched a series of raids on the Iraqi capital, Baghdad. The Iranian Air Force, often referred to as the Iranians, responded by launching daily harassment raids against the Iraqi capital, known as the Baghdad Express. The Iranian pilots excelled in this game of hide-and-seek with the Iraqi interceptors, but, 2 Iraqi Phantoms were shot down. On October 8, 1980, Saddam Hussein ordered 3 Frog ballistic missiles to be fired at the Dezful air base, signaling the launch of the second wave of the terrestrial attack. The Iraqis took only a few miles in 3 days, but used up nearly all their fuel and ammunition. With supplies running dangerously low, they were forced to put an end to a game that had cost them some 30 tanks and won them very little. Furthermore north, General Latif tried to increase his gains, moving in the direction of Kermanshah. His 6th, 8th, and 12th divisions staggered between Qasr-e-Shirin and Sumer. 2 armored brigades left Sari-Pol-e-Zahab, each moving along one of the 2 parallel roads leading to the strategic crossroads in Sarmast and Eslam Abadi Garb. Meanwhile, a mechanized brigade climbed the steep road supposed to lead it to Sarmast, where it hoped to link up with one of the armored brigades having left Sumer. In Basra, Iraqis and Iranians fought a crucial battle for control of Khorramshahr and Abadan. The Iraqi 5th Division sappers crossed the Karun River near Darkhoven aboard inflatable dinghies, and the 26th Armored Brigade crossed the bridge to guard the bridgehead. In less than a minute, 10 Iraqi tanks had been neutralized, and the remaining vehicles had no choice but to flee toward the Karun. The Iraqis captured about 20 chieftains, which they proudly displayed for war correspondents to photograph. On October 11th, the 3rd Armored Division attempted to tighten the nose around Khorramshahr, but their reconnaissance regiment sneaked across the bridge over the Karun 5 miles upriver. This was crucial as it was the only road structure over the Karun to the city of Awaz. the Iraqi reconnaissance troop occupied the Arvan River, cutting off the road to Awaz. The port of Abadan was now isolated, and the 5th Mechanized Division took control of the Abadan-Awaz road. On October 14th, Abadan was besieged, but its garrison held off the Iraqis. On October 18th, the 5th Division's commander ordered his 23rd Brigade to cross the Arvand on a pontoon bridge and attack the Abadan garrison from the rear. However, this attempt failed, and the Iraqis were brutally repelled by M48 tanks and machine gun fire. In Khorramshahr, the 3rd Armored Division's dismounted infantrymen and the 33rd Special Forces Brigade entered the city, backed by 200 T-55 and T-62 tanks. The Iraqi soldiers proceeded slowly and methodically, fighting fiercely and often ending in hand-to-hand combat. The Iraqi military high command decided to tighten the nose around Abadan, as it would be illusory to continue the assault in the direction of Abadan, as they were out of infantry reserves and the Iranian garrison was receiving reinforcements.